Hi there. My name is Derek. I work with Beyond, and our organization is helping to plant thousands of churches all around the world. We only have a small number of people, but we're seeing incredible results. And so, one of the things that a lot of churches ask us is, what is the difference between a movement and traditional church? And are they compatible? So, I want to take you through a training that we do called the Four Phases of Church. We're going to start out with our graph here, and on the left-hand side we see people, and we represent that with a person with a heart as their body, and these are people that are abiding in Christ. These are Christians, and we're going to count the number of believers over time, and time is on the bottom, of course. So we're going to look at four different time periods, and the first phase is the unreached people group phase. That's when the gospel first makes inroads into a people group. Now, when the gospel goes in, we see lots of people come to Christ. And it takes a while to get to this point, of course, but you start seeing what we call red, purple, blue, and green people come to Christ. Red people are those people that accept the word, but aside from maybe telling their spouse or one other person, they really don't share it with anybody. A purple person is someone who might share within their immediate family. A blue person might share with their friends, but a green person is somebody that goes out and shares with everybody that they know. That is someone who returns an investment of 30, 60, even 100-fold on their faith. Well, not all of us are green people, but when you're going into an unreached people group, you're really looking for those green people, and you really want to work with those as much as possible. We're not going to forsake everybody else, but we want those green people, and we want to set them free to be able to share their faith. Now, those green people go out and they look for somebody called a person of peace. A person of peace is someone that opens up their entire relationship network to you. We don't want to just bring individuals to Christ. Our goal is to bring entire communities to Christ. We don't want to extract somebody out so the community sees Christianity as a threat. Rather, our goal is to seek to disciple an entire community to Christ. So these green people look for people of peace, which are usually also green people. And because there are no existing church buildings, whenever they begin to meet together, they meet together wherever it's convenient. Sometimes they meet underneath the largest spreading tree. Sometimes they meet in their offices. Sometimes they meet in coffee shops. Sometimes they meet in restaurants. And of course, a lot of times they meet in homes. And you see we have the house there and with a little red cross inside. This is not a sacred building. This is a normal everyday building that is used. So the first churches are planted within an unreached people group. And as that grows, the green people are looking for more and more and more people of peace. And those people of peace help open up new communities, and those new communities continue to open up new house churches. So we see an explosion of red, purple, blue, and green people, as well as an explosion of people of peace. And around most of these people of peace, we end up seeing a house church being built. And so at this point, we're seeing rapid growth. We're seeing explosive growth. You're going to start seeing people that emerge that have many gifts. Many of the house churches to this point have many people that share the ministry needs of that house church. You might have somebody that's good at sharing the word, another person that's good at being pastoral and caring for people, and somebody else that's really good at reaching out and being that evangelist. Well, these stars start to appear, and these stars are people that have many gifts, many of those gifts. So maybe they're both good at teaching and being a pastoral type person, and they're also good at winning people to faith. And so sometimes these stars starting churches that look a little bit more like a traditional church. They get a little bit larger than those that are in the house churches, and you start seeing these buildings set aside specifically for church. Now, but realize that at this point, these church buildings are still the minority, and most of Christianity is still growing by people of peace and starting communities of Christ that meet in homes, house churches. So I'd like to ask you at this point, so what would be a good name for this phase? A lot of people might come up with a number of different names, but the name that we prefer to call this is the movement phase. Now the movement continues, and more red, green, blue, and purple people end up coming out, and you see more people of peace as well. But something begins to change at a certain point. You see more and more of these stars seeking to reproduce more and more of those stars. And as people begin to see these stars reproducing, they begin to think that this is what should be happening within their house churches. They see somebody that's really good at teaching, and they begin to think this is what should happen in the house church. So you're seeing these stars reproduce other stars, and these churches that these stars are building grow larger and larger. The change starts to happen to where people aren't necessarily seeking people of peace, they're seeking to bring their they're seeking to bring their friends to these churches. And as these churches get larger and larger, they begin to start having pews, and everybody faces the preacher when the preacher speaks instead of sitting in circles. And you're seeing the emergence of something much more structured as far as a church is concerned. The interesting thing is that as this happens, you're seeing more and more qualifications for the people that are leading those house churches. And with qualifications comes a need for more and more Bible knowledge. When you're just having a house church and you're sitting around discussing the Bible or the letters that Paul and the other apostles wrote, or discussing the Old Testament together, you don't really need a strong teacher. But when you start getting to building these larger and larger structures, the main focus becomes on a Sunday morning, a teaching time. So the knowledge, the Bible knowledge of that star that is leading that church becomes very important. And so as those churches grow, the qualifications for Bible knowledge also grows very quickly. And in order to help that Bible knowledge grow, we see something emerge. We see these informal, these practical Bible schools emerge. These Bible schools will both help existing house churches to be able to grow, lay leadership, as well as to reproduce. They're also going to help produce more and more stars to be able to help preach better, and a lot of their focus really is on preaching and teaching the Word. So we're seeing a movement away from a discussion-based house church into a more formal teaching style paradigm. What we begin to see happen is that as more and more focus is put onto these individuals that are leading these larger and larger structures, the focus is more and more on them and what they can do, on the professional clergy, and less on the priesthood of the believer. In the past, we would see these green people going out and reaching entire communities for Christ. The focus, however, once we begin to see these larger and larger structures emerge, begins to be on bringing people to the larger meeting in order for the pastor to be able to share with them. People begin to think, oh, I can't share as good as that pastor is, so they begin letting the pastor do a lot of that work. And a lot of the shift comes to people relying on the pastor for spiritual development and discipleship, rather than having that small group within the home be the center for discipleship and sharing and growing in Christ. So my question to you is, what would be a good name for this third phase? Well, this phase is a lot about emerging, and it's a lot about what's coming next, but this is what we would call the formalizing stage. In this stage, you haven't really seen things become structured yet, but you're beginning to see the growth of structure around these house churches and a transition from house churches into more structured, formal places of worship. At this point, we start to enter stage 4. And in stage 4, we really see very few people of peace being sought out. And we're really seeing a reduction in the number of house churches. We begin to see these house churches consolidating into larger and larger structures. The focus is less and less on community discipleship, where people are learning the Bible and applying it in community. The focus is more and more on getting people to come on Sunday morning to be able to listen to the pastor preach. And people begin moving around from one house church to a larger church to a larger church, seeking those individuals that can really produce a very well-crafted sermon. And people are drawn to those people that are very charismatic and can speak well and have a lot of Bible knowledge. People are drawn to deep Bible knowledge at this point. Well, something else happens too. As people begin going towards larger and larger structures. The small house churches consolidate into small churches consolidate into larger churches, and these larger churches also begin consolidating into larger and larger structures until we see something like this emerge. And it's not just a church, it's a structure that has both Sunday morning worship, it has Bible studies, it has choirs, it has lots of outreaches, it has many, many good things. And in this church, there are very many rooms. And the church does a lot. And it's led generally by one or two very charismatic people that can deliver a very good sermon. If we look at the United States and other places where you have churches that have reached this level, generally the growth percentage per year is somewhere between 3 and 5%. Churches think that if we can grow by 5% per year, that's a great number. 90% to 95% of the growth of these structures happens through consolidation, and only 5 to 10%, and really 10% is the upper number where you have exceptional churches, 5 to 10% of the people coming from the world or unsaved people. Now, a lot of these churches say, well, people weren't getting a good worship experience before, or they weren't getting taught before, and so they say this is a good thing. And while there is truth to that, the problem is that the focus becomes less and less on winning the lost and more on making sure that we're giving the best worship experience and the best teaching as possible. And so somehow a big change comes. We're no longer winning the lost. We're simply consolidating people into larger and larger structures. And of course, to be able to support these larger and larger structures, you have more and more needs. Qualifications begin to grow as well, because now you have an individual that's managing a several $100,000 to several $1 million budget per year. You need somebody that's not just a good pastor, teacher, and evangelist. You also need somebody that's very good at church administration, managing multiple ministries, managing a large budget, executing plans, and making plans. While church in houses was very simple before, you're seeing a move towards a very highly structured organism or organization. So my question to you is, what is a good name for this phase? Some people have suggested organized church. For us, we prefer to call this the institutional phase. And not that it's bad. Big churches are good. There's lots of good ministries that happen from it. Now, remember too that we all reproduce in kind. Generally, house churches reproduce house churches. When a small church, one of these smaller churches on this diagram, reproduces, even though a lot of those initial churches started out as house churches, they seek to reproduce another church in their own kind. So those pastors are no longer looking at reproducing house church leaders to be able to potentially grow a larger church out of those house churches. They're looking to reproduce a fully functional church. So when you get to these large institutional megachurches, these megachurches are also looking at reproducing other structures which will be able to grow into multi-thousand member organizations. Again, we reproduce in kind. And of course, you need lots of training for that. And so you see institutions, seminaries, and Bible schools, formal Bible schools, offering masters and even PhDs to people to be able to lead these larger structures. And of course, we're seeing in the United States many of these structures grow to the point that they're requiring not just one, but 2 PhDs for the leaders of these organizations. Now, here's a question for you. What happens when one of these structures, one of these institutional structures, ends up planting a church in an unreached people group? Remember, churches reproduce in kind. While house churches are very easy to reproduce, and it's very easy to get a strong and very high priesthood of the believer, lots of people participating in those house churches, remember, when you plant an institutional church in an unreached people group, it costs a lot more money and it requires a whole lot more training to be able to lead those structures. Instead of seeing a movement emerge, you see churches reproduce in kind, and they're restrained by the amount of money that they're able to raise to be able to reproduce. But again, a lot of these churches believe that the most important thing for them to do is to reproduce a fully mature church just like themselves. They want to reproduce in kind. So a lot of times it can be difficult for an institutional church or a formalized church to be able to plant a church in an unreached people group. But if we really want to see the unreached people group reached, we really need to find ways to be able to learn again how to reproduce house churches and informal lay leadership. In these house churches, you see people that still have jobs. And the reason why they're so good at multiplying is these people, the primary place where they meet new people for new house churches, these people of peace, is through their jobs, through their work, through the people in the marketplace. And because they're still involved in those places, they still have lots of connections in the community. And that's important. That's really good. Because most pastors and most leaders within these formalized and institutional structures, most of their time is working on leading teams, and so they're leading and interacting primarily with Christians at that point. And we lose the power of those people that are on the grassroots level. So what happens after institutional? You notice that institutional, you've really hit a plateau. Growth has really stalled, and in some cases it starts to go down. Within the institutional phase, something is going to have to happen. Because most of the people are coming not from the world, because they're coming from other structures, and only 5% growth is happening from the world, from unsaved people, decline is coming. And it must happen, because you're simply not winning enough people to be able to maintain the number of people that you have coming to these groups, to these churches. So something happens in 5, and the choice is either decline or reformation. Now, decline is going to be the inevitable, but it may take years and years to get there, but it's going to happen unless you find ways to be able to re-engage and to be able to renew that growth. And most of the time, that growth happens through small groups. And the difference primarily between a small group that multiplies and reaches more and more of the community is whether that small group is a fellowship group or whether that group is a discipleship group. Fellowship is just for people to be able to get together. A lot of times cells within churches end up fulfilling the need of community. Focus is still primarily on getting people to go to the large group. Where we do see institutional churches grow because of small groups, it's because they've learned the lesson that church really is what happens in the homes. And those pastors focus on trying to reproduce individuals within their homes that can disciple their communities for Christ. And so that generally is where the stage 5 regrowth or reformation ends up happening. So, is it possible to see a movement that continues to grow? Yes, absolutely. We have seen this in many places in the world where movements start and they continue to grow, and oftentimes it seems unlimited exponential growth. And a lot of times what happens is, notice how before the priesthood of believer really started to decline. The important thing to be able to see a movement continue is to see the priesthood of the believer stay strong and to continue to grow. The growth is dependent upon the priesthood of the believer. Now, in institutional churches, we like to talk a lot about the priesthood of the believer, but oftentimes, when you really get down to it, it really is mostly on the shoulders of the pastors and the professional staff to lead the church. So, when we want to see a movement grow and continue, we really want to see the focus be on house church, and house is where you do church. Community is where you do church together. A lot of the churches that emerge during this phase will start saying things like, we get together on Sunday for celebration, but this isn't church. Church is what happens in the home. And our focus is on empowering and growing and really training those leaders to be great, to be able to multiply their house groups. And occasionally you start seeing churches say things like, we don't care if they come on Sunday morning, because if they're doing church in the homes, that's what we want them doing. They can baptize, they give, they teach each other, they care for each other, they do all the things that the church is supposed to be doing within the homes. And it's success when they understand that they are all the priesthood of believers. Now, what happens if a church institutionalizes too quickly, right? You see people coming in to plant institutional churches in phase 1 or phase 2, start seminaries, take people out of the place where they're seeing movement, bring them to seminaries, then send them back. Focusing too early on trying to start seminaries within those areas. And really the focus begins very, very quickly to be on having that professional person who can give a really good sermon. And then what you're doing is you're really quickly decreasing the need for that priesthood of the believer. So you have to be very careful when you start to try to plant institutional churches within unreached people groups and within movement phases, because people begin to understand that having a good sermon, that's what the point of this all is all about. People begin thinking having a larger and larger meeting space is what is success. And we have to be careful as well, because a lot of times our unspoken words can influence people into thinking these things. The other thing that we need to realize is sometimes we see movements that grow early and maybe they multiply out and we're really excited about the movement, but they stall out at 1% of the population. Take a look at Japan and other places. Thailand, for instance. They've stalled out at about 1% of the population, and then they institutionalized. So movements sometimes can grow quickly and grow early, but then stall out. And that we don't become comfortable with the fact that we have all these churches, but we forget the fact that we're still at a very, very small number of our population. There are also places like Korea where the movement grows very quickly and very miraculously. In Korea, within about 100 years, they saw about 28% of their population attending church on a regular basis. But in only about 20 to 30 years, there's already a significant decrease because the church has over-institutionalized. And we're hearing this from Korean pastors themselves saying we have over-institutionalized the church to the point where individuals cannot start Bible studies, they cannot reach out to their friends, they cannot do things that we would normally see within the priesthood of believer unless they are trained and appointed by the pastors of those churches. The danger here is that extreme institutionalization has led to a belief that only qualified people can do any of the work of ministry. My Korean pastor friends are very concerned that this 28 to 23% drop is going to decline even further in the very near future. And it's looking like that's going to be that way because young people are leaving the church in droves. Another example might be the United States church, which has institutionalized itself to a point where it's growing only enough to keep up with population growth. Now, there are a lot of people that have numbers that say that the church has declined tremendously in the last 20 to 30 years. However, if we look at Gallup's numbers of the normal, regular church attendance, that number has stayed steady since about 1950. 40% of the United States attends church on a semi-regular basis. Even with all the things that the church is doing and all the advances that the church has done in the last several years, with new worship and new programs, the best that we're doing is we're merely keeping up with population growth. Christians in the United States wonder why the society has changed so much around them. Well, if you look at it, the church has at best only had a minority influence within the United States culture. 40% influence versus 60% of the world of secularism. So if the church really wants to see a change in America, the church is going to have to find a way to be able to get past that 40% mark. And almost always that requires the church going back into some type of homes where the homes are the primary place for discipleship and where people are empowering people to start small groups that reproduce at work, in their places, in their communities, everywhere that people are. And of course, we have the situation in Europe where the average attendance is somewhere around 15% of the population, down from a very high number not too many years before. And a lot of scholars point to institutional rigidity and a cultural irrelevance where people have really been isolated from really understanding how do we interpret the Bible for today's culture. Not saying that we compromise on any of our biblical principles, but church has become irrelevant to people because the church isn't speaking to issues that people are facing. And so that leads to a lack of trust and a lack of interest. And of course, there has been as well, especially in Europe, huge issues of integrity where people just simply do not believe they can trust their church leaders anymore. And that has led to a rapid decline. And a lot of the focus, especially in millennials in the United States, is this distrust of institutions. So I want to leave you with this question. We've talked about four faces of church. What is the people group you work with? And what will be their story? What do you think? What's happening right now? Are you seeing rapid institutionalization? Or do you see the opportunity for movement? Regardless of what is happening, you do have an influence on the future. And we invite you to think about these things and to engage your people group in a wise way to be able to see and prepare for movement for many, many years to come. Thank you.